As a nurse, I thought I had a complete understanding of trauma. On September 30th, 2020, I received a call from my son's daycare. My 19-month-old had just injured his knee and was refusing to walk on his leg, and they were not sure what happened. As I was driving to pick him up, my pediatric trained brain tried reasoning through all the scenarios. I even called one of my ortho trained colleagues who assured me it was probably nothing serious. I arrived at the daycare within 20 minutes, and as soon as I saw him, I knew I was wrong. There are several things that I will never forget from that day. The look of agony on my son's face as he sat in the daycare worker's lap. The whimpering sounds he made as I drove as fast as I could to the children's hospital ER. How the ride seemed endless and how hopeless I felt with each passing minute. Standing in the x-ray room as they held him down on the table and seeing the x-ray from across the room, knowing immediately his femur was completely fractured. The surrealness as a seemingly endless stream of hospital workers entered and left his room, and the feeling of complete helplessness as a mother while your child is in excruciating pain. With the rise of COVID, I was only allowed to stay with him. Due to the location and severity of his fracture, he had to have a cast placed under general anesthesia. Despite having a medical background, I was not prepared for how I would react to seeing him after his cast was placed. Laying on his stomach, pillows propped all around, wires all over his small frame. The cast stretched all the way down his fractured leg, wrapped high around his waist, and halfway down the other leg. We were finally released from the hospital after 2.5 days, and I spent the next 4 weeks supporting a toddler who went from running and jumping to not being able to sit upright in a chair. At the end of the 4 weeks, we were excited, yet apprehensive to have that cast removed. I knew he would not walk right away, but again, I was not prepared for the screams as they removed the cast, as he was able to move his legs for the first time in weeks. I wasn't prepared for how he felt the first time I held him after the cast was off, how light he was, or for how obvious the difference in leg length was between his two legs now. The doctor assured me that he'd be fine, that toddlers heal like salamanders, and his leg would continue to grow to match the other one. If you saw him today, now 2.5, you'd have no idea that he sustained such an injury. He runs, he jumps, I can't catch him. Yet I'm still reminded daily as I put on his shoes and see the lift we use to help with the leg difference. I still worry every time I see him trip or misstep that this injury will impact him as he gets older. And I'm still angry. Angry that I do not know what happened at the daycare that day and that no one can tell me how my child was injured. The experience I just shared with you is an example of primary trauma, the emotional, psychological, and physical reactions to stressful events. Each one of us experiences trauma. Some of us experience isolated trauma, like my sons, and others experience trauma daily. We all carry this trauma around us in different ways. I thought I knew how trauma impacted me and how best to manage myself to be able to cope. I would usually take some time for myself, reset, begin again. What I didn't understand were the implications of trauma on me from other sources. Let's pause here. I want you to visualize with me. Close your eyes and imagine putting on a backpack that you will never take off. Think of some of the trauma in your own life, maybe from your past or from your day-to-day life. Imagine the experiences, the emotions you feel, memories you've held on to, and the struggles you may still have today. Now imagine in this backpack, instead of books and pencils, your backpack is carrying each of those traumas. Every emotion, every memory, every stressor. How heavy is your backpack getting? Are you sitting a little bit lower in your chair, starting to feel weighed down? Now I want you to keep that backpack on while I talk you through my scenario from a different perspective. While caring for my son after his release from the hospital, I took a few days off, but quickly needed to return to work. At that time, I was the chief nursing officer of a federally qualified health center, overseeing a large school-based health program of 26 clinics and over 30 healthcare staff. My days consisted of supporting staff, covering clinics, and ensuring students' medical needs were met within the confines of a school setting. Working with a public school district in Indianapolis, it is not rare for the students we serve to present with their own traumas, carrying their own overflowing backpacks. They come to school hungry, homeless, impacted by violence, struggling with illness, and often emotionally drained. On top of all this, the COVID pandemic has been raging through our country. My staff had their own backpacks, filled with fear of losing their jobs, with schools closing, personal struggles. Many had their own children home as their district schools closed, not to mention the daily stressors unrelated to COVID. What I didn't realize was while I had filled my backpack with my traumas, I was also carrying the traumas of staff and students I encountered throughout the day. The backpack I carried home with me held some of the weight of their traumas, along with my own. This is called secondary trauma, the emotional toll of seeing and hearing about the trauma of others. Now, I want you to recall your backpack. Think about some secondary trauma from others that you may be carrying and put those in your backpack. How heavy is your backpack now? Feeling overwhelmed yet? What you are experiencing is secondary traumatic stress, and it can be just as damaging to your well-being, if not more so, than your primary stressors. Trauma does not just impact us mentally, but also physically. One example of this is allostatic load, shown here in this graph. Depicted here is how these stressors build on one another over time, creating a dramatic change in your normal baseline stress levels. So imagine putting on a backpack that is already heavy, that you can never take off and continues to get heavier over time. But what do we do with this information now? Building awareness of secondary trauma is an important first step. We have heard a lot about trauma-informed care and adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, over the years, but secondary traumatic stress is not getting the attention it needs. It's easier to recognize primary trauma, but secondary trauma, especially for those in caregiver roles, can be difficult to identify. We recognize certain careers are more prone to secondary traumatic stress than others. Teachers, school nurses, and childcare workers, for example, are frequently exposed to secondary trauma and often not equipped to navigate the implications in a healthy way, leading to secondary traumatic stress. Their stress typically rises from emotional labor, which occurs within environments of highly charged emotional interactions with others, for example, working with students. What we do know from the research is that environments of support are the best protection against secondary trauma. So what does that mean? Some examples. Teachers that practice mindfulness and meditation are better protected from secondary trauma. School systems that encourage opportunities for peer support groups create spaces to prevent secondary trauma. And staff members need self-care plans to be aware of the secondary trauma warning signs and have strategies to reduce secondary trauma. Stress happens, but it does not have to turn into secondary traumatic stress. We must cultivate a culture of supportive environments for students and staff through trauma-informed education, awareness, and interventions.